Recently, the issue of the Armenian Orthodox or Chalcedonians has increasingly attracted the attention of researchers. Many aspects of the history of the Armenian ethnos have already been described by scholars. However, despite the numerous articles and monographs that describe the political history of the Armenian Chalcedonians, only a few of them have been devoted to the study of their liturgy and the history of their clergy. In discussing the Armenian Chalcedonian civilization and the work of its prominent figures, we would like to draw attention to the role of the Armenian monks and nuns, which is inseparable from the world Orthodox monasticism as a whole and, in particular, from the Palestinian one. Armenian Chalcedonians in the Middle East, 5th-6th centuries. Recently, the issue of the Armenian Orthodox or Chalcedonians has increasingly attracted the attention of researchers. Many aspects of the history of the Armenian ethnos have already been described by scholars. However, despite the numerous articles and monographs that describe the political history of the Armenian Chalcedonians, only a few of them have been devoted to the study of their liturgy and the history of their clergy. In discussing the Armenian Chalcedonian civilization and the work of its prominent figures, we would like to draw attention to the role of the Armenian monks and nuns, which is inseparable from the world Orthodox monasticism as a whole and, in particular, from the Palestinian one. The Armenian monastic institution has deep roots, which, according to church history, originates from the time of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, 335. It was under his leadership that Greek and Syrian monks from the Roman provinces, Lesser Armenia and Cappadocia arrived in Armenia, who laid the foundation for Armenian monastic life. In the 4th and 5th centuries, Greater Armenia was famous for its numerous dormitory-type monasteries, hermits, and working monks, distinguished by an extremely strict life and high spirituality. Already during the time of Saint Nerses the Great, 373, the number of monasteries and monks had increased significantly, and during the time of Saint Sahak Parhel, 439, and Saint Mesrop Mashdots, 440, Armenian monastic life had a fairly solid foundation. The same was true in Lesser Armenia, which at that time was part of the Roman oikoumene world. This was the name given to the territory of the Roman Empire, the term referring to the civilized Roman world. The strict work and high morality of the monks are testified not only by Armenian contemporaries, but also by Faustus of Byzantium, Moses of Tournai, and foreigners. For example, in the testimony of the world teacher and Archbishop of Constantinople, Saint Gregory the Theologian, we read in his Message to Hellenios, concerning the monks, he says, "Such a new group shines before you in my country, just like the one that Armenia has created, your native land, adorned with good sons and in many other things exalted above other countries, and especially in that there are many in it who have not been bound by the bonds of marriage." In 451, an ecumenical council was convened in the Byzantine city of Chalcedon, which formulated the formula for the two natures of Christ. Many Armenian dioceses that were under the jurisdiction of the Byzantine Church and a significant part of the churches of Lesser Armenia accepted the dogma of the Council of Chalcedon. The dogma was not accepted by the national Armenian Church that was in the territory conquered by Persia. For this reason, the Armenian world was divided into two parts, the Orthodox or Chalcedonians and the anti-Chalcedonians or Monophysites. The Chalcedonian Confession of Faith was signed by the bishops of the major cities of Lesser Armenia in Byzantine, Eastern Rome, Melitene, Sebastopol, Nicopolis, and Theodosiopolis in Armenian Karen. Theodosiopolis was the administrative center of Byzantine Armenia, Inner Armenia. The signatures of the Council of Chalcedon show that this council was attended by Armenian bishops from Ansatine, Sophene, Sopki, Angeline, Anjegtuni, Sophanine, and Martyropol, Tigrankert, whose dioceses were part of the Amid metropolis. From time to time, various individuals leave the Armenian Chalcedonian environment and go to the Palestinian desert to achieve high spiritual heights. The monastic community of Palestine, which had already multiplied in the 4th century, gains great importance and influence in the 5th and 6th centuries. Despite Syrian and Egyptian influence, Palestine, which was located between these two Byzantine districts, was not only inferior to them, but even equal to them. It should be noted here that the territory of Lesser Armenia, a Roman province, itself, and in general the western part of historical Armenia, was influenced by Greek culture, although, as P. Karani's notes, the Armenian language, despite its Hellenization, was not equal to Greek. This Hellenophile Armenian Chalcedonian environment, as N. Mari believed, was adjacent to Cappadocia, in the eastern part of which a significant part of Armenians lived, bordering Lesser Armenia. There were prominent Byzantine figures from Armenia in Cappadocia. Various testimonies show the care of Saint Theodosius the Great, 529, and Saint Sabas the Purifier, 532, who worked in Palestine for the Armenian Chalcedonites. The reason for this is their Cappadocian origin. Theodosius was from the settlement of Magirian, and Sabas was the successor of Theodosius of Mutilaskadani. The hegumen was the Armenian sovereign from the settlement of Zomer near Sebastopol. The entire Armenian Chalcedonite Brotherhood of the Holy Lavra was under the spiritual supervision of Saint Theodosius, which is described in the life of the Holy Father. The personality of Saint Sabas the Purifier, who granted special privileges to the Armenian Chalcedonite monks, is of great interest. His most famous Armenian disciple was Saint Jeremiah the Armenian, 6th century, commemorated on the Saturday of the Sermon on the Mount. Here is what the biographer of Saint Jeremiah, Saint Cyril of Scythopolis, tells us about Saint Jeremiah. At that time, a certain pious and trustworthy father, endowed with divine gifts, named Jeremiah, was received into the Lavra. He was an Armenian by birth. With him were two of his disciples who, like him, were distinguished by morality, were his co-adherents, and were named Peter and Paul. Their arrival as pious people greatly pleased our Father Sabas. He gave them a cave and a small cell, north of his cave, in which he had previously lived when he was alone in the valley. He allowed them to sing in the Armenian language in a small chapel on Saturdays and Sundays. Thus, in a short time, the Armenians in the Lavra multiplied. The divine Paul, a disciple of the blessed Jeremiah, is remembered to this day for his holy life and virtues. He spoke much about Jeremiah, and he told me many things that I write here. The Armenian Chalcedonians own the church of Saint Nicholas the Wonder Worker, carved into a cave, which has survived to us in ruins. This church houses a crypt, where the relics of the holy fathers of the Lavra of Saint Saba the Purifier, who were martyred by Persian pagans in the 6th century, are kept. The Persian pagans attacked the Palestinian territories and brutally tortured the fathers in the Lavra. After Jeremiah the Armenian came to the Lavra of Saint Sabas, Saint John the Silent, or Sabite, 558 December 3/16, also came there. Cyril of Scythia, John's biographer, testifies that this learned father of ours, John, was originally from Armenian Nicopolis, and his parents were Encrates and Euphemia. They were proud of their wealth. Also, he participated in many state, military, ordinary Jewish citizens, and nobles' activities at the imperial court. The Byzantines and Armenians spoke much about them and their deeds. Saint John hid the fact that he was a bishop and worked as a simple monk. In the Lavra of Saint Sabas, according to Cyril of Scythopolis, the powers of divine gifts abounded in him. He became a bearer of light and now, being in the flesh, lived like an angel among the Jews and illuminated the paths leading to the Lord. Saint John was one of the closest and most beloved disciples of Saint Sabas the Purifier. During his work in the Lavra of Saint Sabas, Blessed John became one of the first hesychasts, and he kept this vow for many years. Saint John spent 66 years in the Lavra of Saint Sabas in silence. At the age of 104, Saint Father John peacefully appeared before God. Among the Palestinian saints, a special place was occupied by Saint Euthymius the Great, 473, commemoration, January 20/February 2nd, who was originally from historical Armenia. Cyril of Scythopolis, who described the life of Saint Euthymius, tells us that the heavenly-born Euthymius had parents named Paul and Dionysia, who were famous by name and adorned with divine virtues. Their homeland was Melatina, the Samian metropolis of the Armenians. Saint Euthymius was born in 377. At the age of 29, blessed Euthymius left this village altogether, settled in a cave in Palestine, near Jerusalem, where he worked and became one of the first Armenian saints and where the later famous Lavra was founded. In 429, the Lavra was consecrated by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Juvenal, 422 to 458, and it became a refuge for pilgrims and the poor. After the death of blessed Euthymius, the Lavra of the Venerable Father was turned into a monastery, thanks to which its ruins have survived to us. The Lavra of the Venerable Father Euthymius was of the same order as the famous Lavra of Keratin, which was patronized and paid attention to by the Byzantine Empress Eudokia. Saint Euthymius donated funds to the work of the monks, and soon the Lavra became a higher school among the monks working in Palestine at that time. The monks of the Venerable Theochrist, 467, a friend of Euthymius, from the Lower Synovus and other monasteries of the Synovus order, which were widespread in the Palestinian desert, came to this school. Saint Euthymius established in his Lavra the rules established by Saint Pachomius the Great of Egypt, down to the smallest details of life, for example, the observance of silence during divine services and meals. In case of violation of these rules, the monks were punished by God himself with illnesses that Saint Euthymius cured. Saint Euthymius relied on the experience of Egyptian monks. It is known that he tried to imitate the great Egyptian Father Arsenius. 449 to 450, in The Great Life. He enjoyed listening to stories about the lives of the Egyptian fathers, which were told by monks from nearby monasteries, for example, the Venerable Martyrius and Ilia. Saint Euthymius built his monastic life according to the anchorite type, a secluded, solitary lifestyle, but before his death he predicted that his Lavra, a large monastery, would soon turn into a kinnevy, a monastery of nuns living a communal lifestyle, different from anchoritism and an idiothymmic monastery, and instructed his successor Ilia where, how, and with what regulations this kinnevy should be. 5 years after the death of the Holy Father, the Patriarch of Jerusalem Martyrius, 478 to 486, instructed Deacon Fido to transform the Lavra into a kinnevy. The cells were preserved. A kinnevy building with a wall and a column was built at the burial site of Saint Euthymius. The former church was converted into a refectory and a new temple was built. This episode, clearly distinguishing the understanding of the Lavra and the Synovii, indicates the decline of the Lavra and the celiac life in Palestine after the death of Saint Euthymius and the rise of the Synovii life. The former required spiritually strong leaders, which did not appear after the death of Saint Euthymius. It was necessary for a figure such as Saba the Sanctified, whose activity created a special era in the canons of the 6th century, to survive this type of monastery. After the conversion of the Lavra into a Synovii, the Lavra of Saint Euthymius loses its significance. In the places where Saint Euthymius worked, large monasteries soon appeared, after which the Blessed One went to other less populated places, and there too a whole army of disciples gathered around him, some of whom even became worthy of the patriarchal throne. By the way, the Brotherhood of Saint Euthymius consisted of brothers of various nationalities. Among them were Greeks, Armenians, and others. The last place where Saint Euthymius the Great worked was the Ziph Desert, near the Dead Sea. Saint Euthymius was an example for ascetic monks with his life. He was versatile and had a great influence on the society and people of that time, by which he generously distributed bread during the famine. Not distinguishing between pagans and Christians at that time, not only in Palestine, but also beyond its borders. Saint Euthymius converted many anti-Chalcedonian Christians to the Chalcedonian teaching, including Eudocia, the wife of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius the Younger. The teachings and teachings of blessed Euthymius have been preserved in a small number. The best Christian hymnologists, John of Damascus, Theodore of Studium, and others, dedicated several of their works to the memory of the great ascetic. The closest to Saint Euthymius was his disciple Saint Domtion, 5th century. commemoration on the Saturday of the Feast of the Assumption, born in the same Armenian Melitene, whose activities are described in the life of Saint Euthymius. Interestingly, when Saint Domitian held the position of abbot in the Lavra, according to the testimony of Cyril of Scythopolis, 400 Armenians came to Saint Euthymius the Great, who were coming from Jerusalem to the Jordan, seeking refuge and peace under the roof of the Lavra. Cyril of Scythopolis describes the hospitality that Saint Euthymius extended to his compatriots and how the miracle of the multiplication of bread, wine, and oil took place, and how everyone was sweetly fed to the glory of God. From the above it can be seen that in the Lavra of Saint Sabas the Purifier and Theodosius the Great, the Armenian Chalcedonian Brotherhood had churches, bell towers, and divine services in their native language. Thus, leaving their homeland and going to the Lavra of Saint Sabas, Theodosius, and Ectim, the Armenian Chalcedonian monks went to their compatriots to receive the consolation that they so desperately needed after being far from their homeland. All this convinced the famous Russian scholar V. Bolotov that Cappadocia and Armenia had no less illustrious representatives in Palestine in the 5th-6th centuries, and that the introduction of some Armenian and Cappadocian ecclesiastical decrees into Palestine, and from Palestine to Alexandria, Antioch, and finally to Constantinople was quite possible. The majority of the Armenian monks who came to Palestine were originally from Byzantine Armenia. In 591, the Byzantines, under the leadership of Emperor Flavius Maurice, 582–602, after the battle with the Persians, occupied part of the lands of Armenia. The bishops of Byzantine Armenia gathered in Theodosiopolis, the capital of Byzantine Armenia, in 593 and elected the Catholicos of Byzantine Armenia, the Chalcedonian John of Bagration, 593–611, in the city of Aven. Before John was elevated to the rank of Catholicos, according to the chronicler Moses Kalinkatvitz, he underwent the rites of a monk, which were widespread in the eastern part of the empire at that historical period. The creation of the Orthodox Catholicosate of Aven was a counterbalance to the Monophysite Catholicosate of Vina. Those Catholicosates who were in the Armenian territory conquered by Persia were Persian subjects. The initiators of the creation of the Chalcedonian Catholicosate in Aven were not so much Byzantines as Saint Theodore, Bishop of Theodosiopil in Armenia, late 6th century, commemorated November 28/December 11th, who is canonized by the Orthodox Church and was the leader of the Theodosiopolis philosophers. Saint Theodore was supported in the implementation of his initiative by the bishops of Tehran and other districts of the Byzantine Armenian Sea. It should be noted that a significant part of the Armenian bishops participated in the Council of Theodosiopil, which joined the Church of Constantinople. From the establishment of this Catholicosate until the death of Emperor Maurice, 602, there was a constant theological polemic between the Armenian Chalcedonian Church and the Monophysite Catholicosate of Vina regarding the dual nature of Christ and the Council of Chalcedon. In fact, the strengthening of the Armenian Chalcedonian ecclesiastical organization in Armenia was facilitated by the Armenian Chalcedonian ecclesiastical ties with Palestine. Research conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries has shed additional light on the history of Armenian Chalcedonian monasticism. One example out of 10 can be cited. According to the inscriptions on the tombs of Cosiphus, Josephus, Armenians are also found among the brothers. Armenian presbyter, and monk John the Armenian. Father Cleopakakilides, the author of the work about Chosevites, precisely notes that in this Orthodox monastery there were monks of various nationalities, including, of course, Armenian Chalcedonians, whose churches were under their ownership and where services were held in their native language. The existence of Armenian Chalcedonian monks was also recorded in writing in the south of Palestine, in Sinai. The most famous inhabitants of the Sinai desert were the presbyters Saints Agathon and Ilya the Armenian of Sinai, 6th century, June 4th and 17th. The Arab invasion in the 7th century stopped the flow of Armenian Chalcedonian monks to the monasteries of Palestine. They moved the center of Armenian Chalcedonian monks in the Middle East to Antioch, i.e., territorially closer to historical Armenia, in the region of the famous Black Mountain, as testified by the famous Byzantine canonist Nikon the Black. There were many Armenian Orthodox monks here during the Crusades, 9th–13th centuries. In this article, we set out to take a general look at the process of strengthening and extinguishing Armenian Chalcedonian monasticism. The study of the history of Armenian Chalcedonian monasticism in the context of the entire Middle East in the 5th to 13th centuries awaits the researcher. Recently, the issue of the Armenian Orthodox or Chalcedonians has increasingly attracted the attention of researchers. Many aspects of the history of the Armenian ethnos have already been described by scholars. However, despite the numerous articles and monographs that describe the political history of the Armenian Chalcedonians, only a few of them have been devoted to the study of their liturgy and the history of their clergy. In discussing the Armenian Chalcedonian civilization and the work of its prominent figures, we would like to draw attention to the role of the Armenian monks and nuns, which is inseparable from the world Orthodox monasticism as a whole and, in particular, from the Palestinian one.